Have you ever felt like coping skills are too one size fits all, or struggled with knowing when to use a strategy and when not to use a strategy? Well, this video is for you. My intention for today is to look at having more intentionality in our strategy selection. Because recently I was looking at the EMDR phase 2, which is resource development. It's part of what we do in order to prepare for trauma reprocessing. And I was thinking to myself, it's so important that the guided visualizations or the other coping skills that we explore with a client are the ones that they actually need for their specific situation and what they are most likely to encounter during trauma therapy. Okay, so hear me out, right? Some people benefit from having a safe, calm place visualization, all right? So for example, if they're feeling triggered or feeling unsafe in the present moment because of trauma memories coming up, then they could imagine, for example, like a little secluded beach hut in a sphere of protection, or, a cabin in the woods, some other environment that feels safe and calm and evokes that feeling of safety and calm in their body when they intentionally recall it. Okay. However, other people don't necessarily need to have that feeling of safety and calm, or that's not an emotion state that even feels helpful to them at this point in their trauma recovery journey. So for some people, it might be more beneficial to have a guided visualization that brings up a sense of empowerment, right? Or an inner guide type of figure to help them listen to themselves. So I think this intentionality is really important because, I work with a lot of people who are queer, for example, or have been closeted in different ways about their identity, whether that's religious identity or, traumatic experiences that they've had. And so they've had to mask a lot throughout their life. And one of the common resources that people work on for EMDR reprocessing preparation is a container, okay, where you basically work on compartmentalizing. So taking any of the trauma material that might be coming up when it's not, an appropriate time for it to come up, and then imagining putting it into, for example, like a locked filing cabinet, a locked treasure chest, and securing it for later. However, if you are someone who is coming to therapy because you have over compartmentalized or because, you're tired of suppressing and repressing this material, a container resource might not be the right fit, okay? It might just trigger that, like, no, I'm done containing, I don't want to contain anymore. So I think that it is really important that we be thoughtful about what images we work with, what coping skills are helpful for somebody. I think if the safe, calm place and a container aren't a good fit, sometimes some of the somatic visualizations, like a body scan, a light stream or a healing light visualization can be helpful, working off of the present moment, or experiences of, like power, experiences of competency. We can use a lot of different things. The importance here is really looking, in my opinion, at what someone needs in specific, like what will be most helpful to them with the obstacles that we expect to encounter. Often people know what their wounds are, right? And how they tend to show up. So we can kind of plan backwards from that. So I'm going to circle back here to other ways that we can be intentional around coping skill selection. So one is, I think that when we want to be prepared to manage intense emotions or overwhelm. Emotions in and of themselves are, a valuable form of information. They're experienced both in our brain and in our body. They can see these on like neural networks and brain imaging. They can see in the body like heat activation patterns for different emotions. Being able to name and identify how we're feeling, like I feel sad, I feel angry, is a emotion regulation skill, right? And some of the ways that we can cope with intense emotions are through like grounding exercises, like using our senses, breathing, coming back to the present. We can also process our emotions, right? And our thoughts. So sometimes like journaling, creative expression, reflection, creative writing, music. Like these can all be ways for us to process and express things. And sometimes, like doing a connection with somebody else or connection with ourselves can be a helpful way to cope too. But, it's also situation dependent. And sometimes what we really need to do is take action as well. So if we already have a lot of insight, and we're just kind of stuck, and one of the reasons why we're getting triggered so much is because we feel like we're not taking the action we need. It can be really helpful to look at, taking, a small corrective action, such as setting a boundary, expressing yourself truthfully, being genuine, showing up more authentically, taking care of our own needs, right? Instead of, being uncomfortable and then later being resentful over it, like actually doing what we need to take care of ourselves, or taking a small step towards our goal. Now, sometimes coping skills become less helpful, all right? For example, there's something called rumination. Rumination is a learned habit. It's what we call overthinking is rumination. Rumination is also very common in depression and PTSD, in people with OCD, anxiety. So overthinking, now here's the caveat, right? Like I work with a lot of people who are very successful because they are thinkers. So they say to me, no, Krista, my thinking is very helpful, right? And then when we look at it, we can look at, okay, what's the difference between helpful thinking versus unhelpful thinking? This is important, right? And I think any overthinker who's watching this video can probably think of at least one time in their life when their thought process became unhelpful, right? And usually there's actually some really good strategies for working through when to catch like what's rumination, what's unhelpful, and to then pivot accordingly. And I actually like to work with people on that because it can be really helpful to recognize when it's a good time to break out of the thought process and when's a good time to just let the thoughts continue. But I think that's important, right? So we need to evaluate like when is processing or reflecting or journaling on a topic helpful? When is it moving us towards some corrective action, some kind of resolution, some grieving? And when is it just circular, right? Or a downward spiral? When is it hurtful to us? And so I think that's important to recognize. Also, sometimes we can go right into avoidance with things, right? So if we just kind of stay away from what is, triggering for us, we often don't have the benefit of being able to tolerate it more and more over time. So this is where things like exposure therapy, I actually like a lot of their strategies, because the concept behind exposure is that, by challenging ourselves to practice in small increments, confronting and approaching the things that we are afraid of or that are distressing or disturbing to us, we gradually over time develop confidence and an increased sense of like mastery over the fear. Even if we continue to experience some of the fear, we see that, our feared outcomes don't occur. If they do occur, it's not as bad as we thought it would be. And we can live like a nice, full, big life instead of a life that gets smaller and smaller and smaller due to avoidance. Because avoidance often results in us doing fewer things, seeing fewer people. And, it can become this feedback loop that is just not helpful. So it's kind of nice, I think, sometimes to remember that we have a lot of tools. I like to borrow from like the OCD treatment field, has some really great stuff on how to break these cycles of avoidance on a behavior level. Because sometimes our thoughts only take us so far. We need to do like behavior interventions too. Okay, so other ways that coping skills can go awry are, it's like avoiding confronting what we need to confront, and also like kind of that radical, I would say it's like a pendulum swing, right? Like sometimes when we're coping, we swing a little too far, and then we swing back the other way, and then we swing back the other way, and then it takes us a little while to find like a middle ground or a sense of balance. And that's okay. I think this is just human nature for us to struggle with finding a middle ground. I wrote here a few notes on this topic too. So I think it can be helpful to ask ourselves in the moment, which skill would be most helpful. For example, distraction techniques. So this could be like counting by threes, counting by fives, looking for different colors in an environment, replaying your favorite TV show in your head. Avoidance, that's getting out. Okay, so for example, if you're in recovery from alcoholism and you're at a bar, like just trying to have a normal social situation and the urges become too high, that is a great time to avoid. Absolutely, there is no reason why you have to jeopardize your recovery if you're at your limit. It's much better to just leave and try again another day, right? So there's a case, like there are times when avoidance is a good choice, right? Then there's also titration, or I like to call that the pendulation. So this is where we move between avoidance or distraction and present moment or like distress tolerance, like actually staying with it. So I'll give you an example of this. Like when I have like a bad headache or something, or a migraine, sometimes I will try paying attention to the migraine or the bad headache. I notice the pain, I ask myself some questions about the pain, I orient to it, and then I intentionally orient away from it. So then I'll like find a part of my body that isn't in pain, or I'll distract myself, I'll avoid the pain, and then I'll come back. I'll check in on the pain again, because I found like this kind of pendulation of moving to a safe kind of like in between place and then back to the source of pain, that is good for me. And it's something that we use for chronic pain. Also in trauma reprocessing, we can do that. So we can actually talk and work on a little bit of the trauma material and then move away from it, talk and work on something positive, something that you feel confident about, your future goals. And actually moving back and forth like this is really helpful because it can help us regulate, your emotions. It also prevents the trauma from taking up too much space, from us losing sight of the present moment and your present reality. Because when trauma is activated, often, we feel the way we felt when the trauma occurred, right? Like we can lose our sense of power, our sense of hope, our sense of a future, our sense of integrity, like a bodily integrity, autonomy. So being able to step out of that trauma space and experience some of those positive affects in the moment is really important, I think, because we don't want to stay there and end session there. We want to be able to move back and forth. And this also increases our sense of control over the material too, because in the present, it might be helpful to be like, oh, the trauma material is getting activated. Let me pay attention to it for a moment. Let me do like 5 or 10 minutes of journaling. And now that I've done it, I've spent enough time on it, I'm going to orient back to the present. I'm going to do something constructive. I'm going to do some self-soothing. Just, allow the emotion to pass rather than staying with it. Because sometimes there's this trap too, where we want to figure out more, we feel driven or compelled to understand more of our trauma, or to find like certainty in areas where there's a lot of uncertainty. This happens a lot with dissociation, right? Like there can be big gaps in trauma memories. And often it's really disturbing, to have a gap in your memory. Like who wants that, right? And so there can be this compulsion to try to figure it out, to try to get more clarity, to try to get missed, or lost memories. But in reality, that searching isn't always in our best interest. And so I think this is where that intentionality around coping skills come into play, where it's like, okay, recognizing that there is a defense mechanism in place, right? Like if we can't remember something, our mind usually has some protective dynamic at play, right? We can usually trust that our minds are doing, at one point or another, it was a protective mechanism. It might be a little out of hand now, but at some point it worked. Otherwise it wouldn't do it. So just kind of recognizing that there's probably a function there or some protective element. And then being really thoughtful about what is most helpful for me at this moment, right? Like if I'm going to try to break down that wall or open that door, it's probably really important that I have a full amount of tools available. I have a strong support system that I can access, you know, doing it with the support of a therapist or another healer, just to really kind of be in our best interest. Because I think sometimes we can really, you know, I've encountered times where it's unhelpful to be stuck going down, and then from an OCD perspective, sometimes it's like trying to understand, trying to remember can, you know, become more harmful. So I think this is where the intentionality behind the coping skills is so important, because journaling for hours and hours a day would probably not be very healthy for most people. I could see it being isolating, you know, it taking up time that could be spent doing other activities. It's just all like, we need to think of the big picture and really look at the cost and benefit of these different things. For example, like when I get my blood drawn, do I focus on the sensation of them putting the needle in? No, I do not. I think of the sensation in my foot. And, you know, I pay enough attention so that I can hear what the woman's saying to me. Or, you know, man, whoever's drawing my blood, pay enough attention for that, but I don't try to pay attention specifically to the pain. Every once in a while, I'll check in on the pain, because I want to know, like, yes, it's temporary. Yes, I can tolerate it. You know, I don't have to be afraid of pain, but I don't have to like focus and zoom in on it the whole time. Like, to me, that's not helpful. But I just think it's helpful to be aware of these options we have, right? Distraction, avoidance, titration, that we can soothe ourselves, comfort ourselves as needed. We build tolerance by challenging ourselves at times, right? By confronting the pain or confronting the fear. And we also build resilience by practicing these coping skills. Like, I think you know, some of the things I do to maintain my resilience are, you know, like to try to get enough sleep, you know, within my power and control, obviously. There's limitations to that, but try to get enough exercise, try to eat well, talk to friends, you know, not overwork, kind of like try to have good boundaries with myself and others, like express myself. That's a big one, I think, for trauma recovery. You know, speaking up for myself helps me feel empowered. It also helps me, you know, get that healing from the past, right? Being able to speak my mind and set my boundaries and meet my own needs is really great. And then I think two things like journaling or the creative stuff can also be really helpful, but all in the right kind of amounts, like just asking, like, what do I need right now? You know, why am I reaching for this? You know, just taking a second to look at it. And anyhow, in closing, I just wanted to say that I do think this is kind of an interesting topic. I hope that coping skills and being more intentional about them is kind of something that gets you thinking about it. Thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to hear too, you know, what you think about when it comes to coping skill selection, and if there's anything you'll take away from this video. Thank you for listening.